Genshin Impact, I've mentioned this numerous times across my channel. Ultimately, it was my first gacha game, and I wouldn't be able to say I'm here covering multiple gacha games like Blue Archive or Arknights if it wasn't for this game's existence. And I don't think it's inaccurate to say this is one of the most well-known gacha games, if not the most well-known. However, as I've mentioned numerous times before, popularity doesn't necessarily come without its downsides, and Genshin is no stranger to that. And despite the fact that I've played numerous gacha games, I still find myself returning to this one. So, in today's video, we're going to discuss my complicated relationship with Genshin Impact, and why this game is easy to hate, but incredibly hard to drop. To give you a little bit of setup, I started Genshin Impact pretty shortly after release. I wasn't necessarily new and didn't necessarily understand gacha games at the time, so I was mostly playing just out of pure enjoyment. The first content creators I watched were individuals like Tenha, Tectone, and Mtashed, and I even re-rolled at the start to pick up Venti. Keeping that in mind, I was stuck with this game from the very beginning, through every patch including the Endless Ayaka banner. And ultimately, I can say I've enjoyed my experience and will continue to play this game, and I want to clarify that. I'm not an individual who hates this game. I think it's still a wonderful experience, but I don't think there's anything wrong with criticizing it. However, I do think there is a difference between criticizing a game and just blatant negativity. And if you yourself have not played Genshin Impact, I don't think it's fair to criticize the game because you yourself have not experienced it. With this in mind, we're going to briefly discuss different topics of the game. For instance, the combat and general gameplay, the endgame issue, the story and world building, and obviously the gacha system. I won't go too heavily in depth into controversies or the community because I do believe they deserve a separate video entirely. So with that being said, let's start out with the gameplay. Ultimately, if you've been here from the very beginning of Genshin Impact's release and have stayed up until now, you understand that gameplay and mechanics have gotten slightly more complicated as time goes on. Characters like Diluc, who went from originally having very universally applicable and simple kits, to characters such as Ayato or Nahida, who now have much more complex kits that either revolve around multi-stat scaling or alternatively are entirely based around elemental reactions and different types. Dendro, for instance, brought numerous reactions that are much more complex than the basic elemental reaction to be had in the game's launch, such as Vaporize or Melt. Depending on who you are, these elemental reactions have brought either some new variety into your gameplay, or if you're like me and you already have staple teams that you utilize, they haven't changed much. But the complex mechanics and the different playstyles of units can't be ignored. We've had units go from simple elemental burst spammers to units that are prioritizing their skills, to generally supportive units with multi-stat scaling, and each of these have to some degree alleviated the tension on artifacts, which deserve their own separate area. Because of this, it's very likely that if you play Genshin Impact and you do enjoy the gameplay and the combat mechanics, you're very likely to find a character who you generally like to play with. If you prefer auto attacks, someone like Razor, Eula, or even Diluc may be for you. If you prefer ranged characters, your Mia with her auto attack spam may be perfect for you. If you're an individual who likes seeing large numbers, you could utilize a Eula with her elemental burst, a Melt Ganyu, Raiden Shogun, or a Hu Tao, amongst numerous others. There's different varieties and compositions, and I don't think individuals really talk about that much when they discuss how or why individuals and people choose to play Genshin Impact. The variety in compositions and variety in teams you have ultimately provides you with something unique to do at every opportunity. If you have a character, that's an opportunity for you to play someone you haven't before. And although people may dislike it, the mindset of just building and playing a different character is valid. Now, I would like to clarify, I don't think saying build a different character if you find the gameplay too easy is a valid complaint. I do think, however, it's valid to mention that there is an opportunity in building another character and playing them. I, for instance, played Xiao for an extremely long time, then I switched over to Yoimiya, and I have picked up different characters along the way. And as a result, each and every one of these units have given me different gameplay styles. Yoimiya's attack string is entirely different from Ganyu's playstyle, and Ganyu is entirely different from Xiao, Xiao being different from Raiden. The compositions you put together and the characters you utilize and how you choose to utilize them does make them different enough to validate the concept of playing different teams and playing different units. The unique combat system and unique mechanics of that are oftentimes alleviated by endgame. And now, whilst I wanted to give endgame a bigger focus in a later portion of the video, I do think it's more important and more intertwined with the combat system of the game given its current state. So keeping this in mind, endgame in Genshin Impact revolves around two concepts. Firstly, the Abyss, which can be either extremely difficult or extremely easy depending on your characters, the investment required, and the current units in it. This means that characters like Eula may face more difficulty against rune-based enemies given their innate physical resistance, whereas if you utilize somebody like Ganyu, you may have a much easier time against enemies that can take elemental reaction damage or elemental damage in general, but if you're facing off against something like Cryo Slimes, you're basically useless. Whilst endgame is a heavy complaint because individuals don't necessarily feel a need to continue building up their characters to get stronger when the content they face doesn't require it, the combat in most instances is enough for individuals to continue playing. The unique and fun elemental reactions, unique opportunities, and unique team compositions allows them the flexibility to not focus as heavily on endgame. And I think it's incredibly important to mention that endgame isn't necessarily a core or critical factor for a lot of people. If you generally have fun with the combat style, you don't care too much about the hardest content. No Genshin Impact video will be complete without discussing the artifact system in the game. Artifacts are irrevocably tied to the status and strength of your characters, and as a result they're directly tied into gameplay. But while they don't affect how you play your units, they instead affect the strength of your units, and as a result they have their separate portion. I won't focus too heavily on it, but I think the point to get across with artifact system is that it's meant to be a repeated grind that allows you to slowly improve your units. The main issue people face with is that content itself doesn't necessarily warrant the level of difficulty that comes with artifact grinding, and that artifact grinding isn't a supplement for more gameplay. You spend resin on either building up your characters in terms of talent potential, building up your characters in terms of the overall level, or building up your characters in terms of artifacts. And artifacts are the only RNG based instance of this because there is no guarantee for you to get a good artifact no matter how much resin you spend. As a result of this, players who have played for an extremely long time feel deterred from artifact grinding because they don't know if it's worth it for the state of their account. The Strongbox has alleviated this to some issue, but it's still an important problem that I think does deserve some buffs or changes. Boosting or allowing some form of reroll for artifact systems in the game would alleviate this, but then the question comes back to, is there content that warrants it? And at the moment there is not. I personally, however, still continue to farm for artifacts just to build up the units that I enjoy and seeing them get stronger. You, however, may differ. Genshin Impact is a gacha game that increasingly expands and adds on to new areas, new stories, new characters, and as a result, the story and world building itself is constantly growing. An individual who played this game upon release has had to slowly listen and understand drip-fed content, but if you were to start the game now, you have so much more story available to you at the moment that it feels overwhelming, to a degree at least. This has led to some content droughts where individuals can complete or speedrun an entire story quest or an entire Archon quest in about an hour or even 3 hours, and as a result are left waiting until the next month for the new patch of story content. However, I don't think this is necessarily an issue. Genshin Impact isn't a game that's meant to be speedrun, as the main content focuses around combat. And the numerous additions of Archon quests, event quests, story quests for individual characters, side quests, and world quests mean that there is so many different activities for you to learn about either the world you're in, the region you're in, or the characters themselves that it's impactful enough for many individuals to continue playing long term. Whether you enjoy a particular unit, such as Fischl, and as a direct result love the Golden Apple Archipelago questline, or the Unreconciled Stars which featured Mona, or perhaps you enjoy the Dragon's Mine quest featuring Albedo. There are numerous different events and questlines out there for you to experience, even if some are currently not available anymore. As a result, there are numerous opportunities for you to find and love a character or unit who maybe you didn't previously like or play, such as Jinyan. As a result, whilst the writing itself and there may be certain units such as Paimon that people do dislike vehemently, the lore and the characters themselves are extremely well done, with each of them not only having their own voice lines and their own backstories, but also that being told in their character profiles and in the weapons they sometimes use. For instance, the Golden Majesty series is entirely fixed around Zhongli, and if you have any of these weapons, you can read different lore about him. You have artifact sets which delve in deep to characters and units' backstories and pasts, such as the Crimson Witch of Flame set and the Husk of Opulent Dreams. There is more than enough story content to keep individuals who actively seek it busy for an extremely long period of time, and there's a very high inclination for you to not know everything about even the units that you love. As such, Genshin Impact doesn't necessarily lack for story-based content. The Gacha system. No gacha game would be complete without it, and Genshin Impact has its flaws. Many individuals do take issues, and it has changed over time. If you want a primary example of how bad the gacha system can be, my recommendation is to watch Tectone's Staff of Homa summons. The weapon banner in Genshin Impact has always been a point of contention throughout the community. This is in part due to pity not necessarily carrying over, or in this instance fate points, but instead it's more the concept that previously the weapon banner had no guarantee for you getting the individual weapon you wanted. At the time of recording this video, the Thundering Pulse for Yoimiya and the 1000 Floating Dreams weapon for Nahida are both available. Previously, under Genshin Impact's weapon banner, you could roll an infinite number of times and theoretically never get the 1000 Floating Dreams. Now there's a fate point system integrated into the game, in which you only have to lose the 50-50 and get either the Thundering Pulse or a different weapon twice before having a guaranteed opportunity to grab the 1000 Floating Dreams. Whilst this is not as kind as the character banner, it is still better than it previously was. The gacha system once again depends always on how lucky you as an individual are. If you always win your 50-50s and always get the weapon you want, it may seem extremely nice to you, but for others, it can seem incredibly painful. If you were to drop $100 into the game, it could be the equivalent of 45 rolls, excluding any matchless star glitter which can be converted into rolls once more that you may get back along the way. Pity is at 90, with soft pity being at 75, or 65 for the weapon banner. As a result, you have to pay at most $400 to $500 for a guaranteed character, in the event that you lose the 50-50 and have to go to hard pity. Luckily for character banners, pity carries over between banners, and if you lose the 50-50 and get a standard banner unit, you do have an opportunity to grab a guaranteed one next time. This oftentimes does lead to individuals skipping out on units that they may like because they have or are saving for a unit that they do like due to them having the guarantee. The gacha system is better than some I've tried, but not necessarily the best. However, if you are a new player, the gacha system may be extremely kind to you by giving you a bunch of newer 4-star units who we didn't have upon release. An example being Diona, who solidifies the shielding and healing role into one, alongside the recent introduction of Tignari into the standard banner. I won't speak too heavily on the gacha system because, as I've said before, it can depend incredibly on who you are, what other gachas you played, but I do think it's best to at least give it a shot and understand that there are times in which it may be unkind to you, as is the case with all gachas. If you've been watching this far, you know that I haven't necessarily been too negative about this game. This isn't because I believe Genshin Impact is perfect. The game has flaws, however I do think it's important to give them their own section, and that's what this is. Genshin Impact is a large game, and despite its many positives and praises that I could sing, the game does have inherent flaws, from the artifact system being so bad that you could spend thousands and thousands worth of resin to not necessarily get a single upgrade for a unit, to AI that sometimes doesn't work properly in the event that you're using a character like Beidou who relies on parries, an auto-targeting system that can sometimes lead to your characters shooting their ult outside of the abyss or directly at the enemy you were not facing, characters climbing in the midst of combat, meaning that objects and sometimes fights can be ruined entirely because of a split-second decision that you didn't necessarily have control over, co-op ruining a large amount of content, meaning that you can't access or talk to certain characters, commissions being unchanged despite how much content the game currently has in terms of size, the resin cap still being 160, which originally was 120 until it was raised. As of right now, we have Sumeru and Enkonomiya alongside Inazuma, as such the resin cap for most individuals should be raised. However, the more important issue is that weekly bosses, which are required to raise certain characters, and the world bosses, which are also required to raise characters, is resin gated, meaning that if you were to get a new character, you must spend 1/4 at minimum of your total or daily allotment of resin to build them up one time. This grounds and expands upon each time as the requirements and materials needed to raise characters grows with each ascension. For weekly bosses, it is 30 resin up until 3 times used, in which it costs 60 resin, dramatically altering your daily capacity for resin and dramatically altering how much you actually can do with it, leading many players to ignore weekly bosses entirely. Genshin Impact does have its flaws, however I do believe the game is hated more often than not, and a lot of that hatred is undeserved. Whether you're an individual who's directly interacted with the Genshin Impact community or seen bits of drama here and there, I believe that Genshin Impact as a whole is a fundamentally fun game if you just choose to play a game without interacting with the community. But if you do, just like with all others, especially if you've watched this channel for a long time, your opinion can dramatically depend on who you choose to interact with and your experiences had. In the Discord server, if you haven't joined, the link will be down below. The community is quite nice, but there are issues, and occasionally you do have individuals who have a negative perception of the game despite not playing it or playing it for a short while. But do keep in mind, many individuals will think of arbitrary reasons to hate a game, from the fact that it's developed by a Chinese company, to the fact that it's simply extremely popular, another reason being that it's gacha, or another being that it's just an anime game, or at least anime aesthetic. For a while, Genshin Impact was called a Breath of the Wild clone. And there are many reasons, but none of them necessarily speak upon the quality of the game itself, and that can only be judged by you. I personally will continue to play Genshin Impact, but I ultimately do believe that if you haven't played it already, and maybe if you dropped it a long time ago, I think it deserves at least a second shot, or a first try. If you don't find yourself enjoying the game, that is perfectly valid, but I think it is unfair and unwise to criticize a game that you haven't played before for arbitrary reasons, because in general, the gameplay itself is what determines your enjoyment. And I don't think it's fair to ruin or stifle other enjoyment just because you don't like what they do or play. We all play video games, we all play gacha games, and at the end of the day, you should be playing for yourself, not anyone else. With that all being said, my name has been Anaki. If you've enjoyed this video, leave a like down below, consider subscribing because it would really help out the channel. Hit the notification bell, and tell me down below, have you played Genshin Impact before? Have you dropped it? Why did you drop it? And do you have different opinions that maybe I didn't cover in this video itself? I will be making a follow-up video talking about the community itself and controversies, but ultimately I do want to cut this short here because it's already pretty long. Regardless, if you're a gacha player or not, good luck, and I hope to see you next time.